The Village by Robert P. Fitton, Part 1. Ending meant the forced cessation of biological life, but simulation continued forever. Rawlings knew all that when he heard the unnerving news from his endings division. A seasoned village security officer such as Conrad was not prone to outlandish theories, yet the reports of tampering with medical ending scans involving 6 village citizens would mean a larger investigation. He sat in the air sweeper's forward section and gazed out over the rugged mountain slopes in what used to be Colorado and was now Sector 15. The sweeper was still 15 minutes from the village. Unlike most of the 17 million village inhabitants, Rawlings enjoyed shutting off the imager inside his brain and experiencing life the old-fashioned way, just using his brain's perception. Today was a productive day. He and his men, along with 12 drogues, had successfully deported and relocated an accumulation of 52 outsiders who had illegally entered the village. People on the outside would always wish entry into the superior village lifestyle. He couldn't blame them for trying, but why not take the legal route and apply in advance for temporary entry? With the proper behavior, full village citizenship would eventually be invested. Judging the motives of illegal entries was not his job. He was an inspector in the village's Denver section. Once he retired, he would choose whether to go to the outside where he had spent his youth, or remain inside the village and undergo image-provided realities for the rest of his days. The medical tampering accusation bothered him enough to open a channel to the village. Without actually being inside, he couldn't activate his imager and direct communications to his brain. A 2-dimensional image would have to suffice. He summoned Conrad. The block-faced Conrad popped on the screen several seconds later. He was always unshaven and his red overlap coat wrinkled. Rawlings' image fed into Conrad's brain imager, and he smiled, lifting his double chin high above his tight red neck shirt.
"Harold, you couldn't resist calling me about the tampering, could you?"
Rawlings raised his wiry eyebrows and smiled. If this were the 20th century, he'd probably be adjusting a long-stemmed pipe, as he thought. He liked pipes and used them in his imaging simulations inside the village. That was the harm of retiring on the outside. Real-life pipe smoking would endanger his health. Why would anyone want to change medical records for those people who wish to terminate their lives?
Well, I've been asking myself that ever since I noticed the pattern. I don't think we're readily going to get that answer.
Rawlings shook his head and watched the treetops whipping under the sweeper. That wasn't the answer he wanted to hear. He squinted as he thought. Maybe it was a malfunction. Purposefully altering termination medical scans made no sense. Every villager had the choice to end his own life. "John, I want those scans in my imager when I get back to the village." Conrad smiled and his lower chin rippled like waves across the waters.
"For a man who's not going to get involved in this investigation..."
"Maybe it's time I do get involved, John. I'll image you when I'm done. Thanks for your hard work."
"I know if I stayed around long enough, I'd stumble into some significant case, Harold."
Rawlings nodded and ended the transmission. A malfunction could be traced to the mainstream. The mainstream controlled everything, and creating their intelligence was as significant a human achievement as imaging. Every village city had a secure area below the surface for mainstream control. The mainstream coordinated the environment, all imaging, the archives, and information. Those who created the early computers would be astounded by the realm of intelligence contained within each mainstream. The likelihood of the mainstream, so sophisticated and highly evolved, making a mistake was impossible. From high above the mountains, the village, 1,000 meters high at the apex, assumed the shape of a sleeping creature in the wilderness. Glossy black perforated stripes, containing tube transits, walkways, and energy collectors, tapered down the sloping beige strucrete. Rawlings thought the village resembled the top of a skull embedded in the forest valley. He stood and walked over to the very large window span as the sweeper circled. At night, the village's upper linear buildings along a 15-kilometer apex was the only illumination in the valley. Other sweepers and aircraft waited to land. He headed to the drogue section near his personal cabin. Having lived the first 21 years of his life on the outside, Rawlings marveled how the drogues piloted ships. Drogue served humanity, subordinated within a 4 by 5 inch frame in a generic voice. Drogue, how long is the delay? The voice exited the front speakers.
Delay is 15 minutes.
Thank you. Drogues appeared alive, but were actually powered by long-range boosters. Complex internal pathways carried pulses quickly, yet the higher abstract-level thinking eluded them. A human-shaped pliable shell was colored to the particular city they served. The Denver drogues were a heightened green, while the village humans hid implanted image mesh under the skull. The drogues' transparent skulls were laced with black transmitting mesh. Fuzzy vermilion eyes glowed when they focused, and green indefinite-edged auditory receptors appeared in place of human ears. For over 100 years, the villagers accepted drogues as a part of life. Rawlings returned to the sweeper window. Long, clear tube transits extended across the landscape like arms from the village. They glowed at night to the exposures 5 kilometers away near the mountains. Exposures were the legal entry point for those outsiders wishing to make a new life in the village. As a young man, Rawlings stood with his application visa scan inside the exposure's smoky glass. He had waited in residence for 9 months before being granted a temporary status inside the village. Because he had entered using the correct procedure, he now had no patience with illegals. The woozy drogue voice broke his concentration.
We are landing, Inspector.
Good, thank you. Rawlings took his seat. The sweeper had already begun a vertical descent between the apex's security buildings. He stroked his chin and hoped that John Conrad's medical tampering problem was a mistake or a simple malfunction. He didn't need murder cases. Murder cases meant trials and an instant ending for the guilty. The practice of letting drogues enter a courtroom and placing an ending capsule over the guilty party's body had never sat well with him anyways. Having a man's body reduced to white and brown crystals in 11 seconds was not right. Like all endings, the procedure was not something he could change. Rawlings briefly met with his own men as they left the sweeper, but after a full day's work he returned to his dwelling. He used the stairs to descend to the 260th level, then waited for the horizontal tube transit. Once on the train, he still refrained from activating his imager, preferring to physically gaze into the deep cavern streets. Each of the 300 levels was inundated with blocks, colored like drogues, according to the city sectors. Inside these blocks, module dwellings and offices existed within a simulated sunlight, filtered down from a fabricated skylight above the cavernous, slowly curving streets. Modules were connected by linear tube transits, while vertical tubes were staggered every few hundred meters at the stairwells. When he leaned far enough out against the glass, he saw the business district hundreds of meters below. If people wanted to leave the simulated images of their modules, they could experience real life only on the first level departure rooms or in the exposures. The transit slowed at his section, and Rawlings moved into a spacious, well-lit corridor off the main street. His module was exactly 410 steps from the transit. At the arched entry point, he was scanned, and the doors slid open. He stepped into a 40 by 40 white-walled room with side imaging sections. As the doors clamped shut, he activated the imager inside his head. Still obsessed with work, he imaged his own office, scattering it with employees and workstations so he would feel as if he were really working. On his desk screen, he summoned up John Conrad's findings. He enlarged the screen across the wall, and a series of colored body slices filled the wall. They were subtitled, Anthony Greco, age 117, second month, day 13, ending voluntary, fourth month, 9th day. Conrad's accusations were evident. In less than 2 months, a relatively healthy individual was diagnosed quickly with an advancing genetic breakdown. The pattern continued as he advanced the screen. A woman in her 70s had perfect readings 3 weeks before her own voluntary ending. This was very unusual. Endings were normally preceded by many months of medical determination. Someone was knocking within his imager. He could hear a gentle beep. Yes.
It's John. It's John. I got additional information.
Sure, John, come in. Conrad, a perplexed look on his face, stood at his desk and held a purple disc. What's on the disc there, Johnny?
I've got a live one, Harold. A Walter Embers, 72. Ending is scheduled tomorrow at 6 p.m. Son Neal in Denver section. 2 other sons on the outside. Looks like Zephyr Creek. Wife was deceased 5 years ago.
Conrad popped in the disc, stood back, and studied Walter Embers' body scan from 2 weeks ago. Readouts indicated he was 20 years younger than his biological age, but the second scan showed a body-wide deterioration. Rawlings stepped back and crossed his arms. John, have you talked to the medical advisors? What the hell is going on here? Man just doesn't fall apart, because that's what I see is about to happen to Embers.
Agreed. To answer your question, I've talked to the diagnostic people. I've got the runaround from them and the mainstream. They both tell me what's happened, and that's it.
How does Embers and his family feel about it?
Well, that's another problem. I've tried to get through to them. Neal, the son, is not answering my calls nor the messages I left in his imager. Walter Embers has shut off all communication with the outside as he prepares for his ending.
Rawlings pushed his fingertips across his eyes. The sweeper ride to the outside had been tiring. More than fatigue, he had a bad feeling about all of this. This isn't right. I keep thinking about murder, John.
Me too.
Rawlings shut off all body readouts. He had seen too many cases in his career to be stifled. Conrad must have wondered why he had shut down the images, and Rawlings kept him in anticipation. He walked over to his metal desk and pulled out his pipe. As Conrad anxiously awaited, he lit a long wooden match. Do you agree that the medical people as well as the Embers clan will not cooperate? Conrad nodded. Okay, you said he had sons on the outside. Contact them two-dimensionally. I bet all my fortunes that they don't know about his father's ending. Get them provoked while I try the medical people. I may have to bring this to a higher level, but I don't want to do anything stupid to ruin my record near retirement. Conrad sat on the edge of the desk. He raised his brows and looked up at his friend.
Harold, you and I have been doing this a long time, but I've got to tell you I haven't got the slightest idea what's going on here.
Rawlings puffed on the pipe. His eyes brightened, and he actually enjoyed being baffled. Having a challenge this late in his career was intriguing. Neither do I, John. Neither do I. Around 11 o'clock, Henry Sykes gave Mark Embers word of the village transmission. Mark immediately left his job at the garage and started up the town hill to the transmission tower. He sent Tom Cortlandt into the forest to tell Frank the village had left a message. As he moved up the half-paved road, he wondered why his father or Neal would call from the inside. The transmission shack was in a clearing overlooking more hills. Because many people had chosen the village life, it became increasingly difficult to offer communications to individual houses. All phone and visual communication had to be directed into the central shack. Now it was the link to the outside world. Henry, a little man with crystal blue eyes and a white beard, walked from the living quarters. He held a large cup of coffee. Good morning, Mark. Mark wiped his greasy hands on a rag. Henry, it has to be 90 out there, and you're drinking a hot cup of coffee? You want some? Hot day, hot liquid. Makes you sweat. Keeps you cool. Mark grinned and looked across the braided rug to the old monitors on the counter. The monitors were linked, as were the old optical tables, up the white block walls through a jagged hole in the ceiling. Have you heard the message? Nope, not yet. He pulled out 2 painted oak chairs and dragged them across the tiles on the outside rug. Here, sit down, Mark. Take a load off your feet. Mark sat down. It did feel good to sit down after working on car engines all day. I don't like communications from the village, Henry. A word from on high. Henry revealed an element of truth in what he was saying. The village life his father and brother had chosen was at odds with everything he believed. With their images, villages could have everything they desired. Restraint was non-existent. Henry leaned over the counter. He pushed a button in a larger screen filled with snow. Then he reached for one of his recorders, popped out a tape relabeled in black ink at least 10 times. This is it right here. How do you keep track of everything, Henry? He pointed through his long white hair. I keep it all up here. Long as I get the parts shipments, I can keep it going. That's how I keep rebuilding cars. Henry pushed the tape back inside. Once was a time you could buy all this new, and when it didn't work, you just threw it out. Sounds like the village. Henry pushed the play button and the snow-filled screen turned blue. Then he looked at Mark. Even when you could buy something, Mark, it was never like the village excess. Well, that's true. Mark turned as the screen filled with bright yellow letters. From the office of Harold Rawlings, Village Security, Denver Sector, 16-07-345. An aging man with a long face stood in front of a busy office. He wore a blue-sleeved shirt and had a dark bow tie. Mark figured the office was a simulation, and like most people in the village, this man was really speaking from one of those bare-walled modules.
I'm Inspector Harold Rawlings. This message is for Mark and Frank Embers, Zephyr Creek Settlement. Gentlemen, my office is investigating a series of problems involving altered medical records. I do not wish to be the bearer of bad news, but your father has chosen to end his life.
Mark leaned back, grasping the chair arms tightly. He could never understand the village practice of voluntarily ending life. Now his own father would soon be dead.
Gentlemen, the reason I am transmitting this message to you involves falsified medical records. My office has discovered that other endings recently have been preceded by a radical change in medical status. We have discovered this change in your father's condition.
Rawlings walked around his desk and sat on the edge. Mark was even more appalled at the idea of endings than he was about some irregularity. The inspector's dark eyes tightened.
I need to talk with your brother and your father. We're having a great difficulty reaching both of them. By delaying this ending, we may, at the very least, be able to check the validity of the medical records. We don't want an unnecessary death here. You can reach me by transmitting to the village and inputting the Denver sector code into your computer if you have one. If not, contact the communications juncture. My imager will respond to 1066-035.
Henry laughed. Computer, that's a good one. We haven't had computer parts here in years. We'll have to do it by the phone tones.
Thank you for your cooperation in this matter.
Mark stared at the screen as it turned to blue. Henry shut off the screen and the recorder. Mark had not seen his father in 7 years. Every year, Neal met him at the exposure, 5 kilometers outside the village. To give up real life and accept the simulated imager life was incomprehensible. Can't let my father take his own life. Villagers have that right, said Henry, popping the tape. You want me to save this for Frank? Mark shook his head and stood. He walked over to the open window and swatted away a fly as he gazed down into town. The tall white steeple reminded him real life meant real values. Nothing was simulated at Zephyr Creek. Everyone struggled to survive, and he couldn't understand how villages voluntarily ended their own lives. Now that philosophy had touched his own family members. I'm not waiting for Frank. See if you can get the village and let me know how much it will cost. Should I call Inspector Rawlings? No, not yet. Try my father. I know I can't stop my father's action, but we may delay it enough while we travel to the village. Village is 235 kilometers away, Mark, over dirt roads and uncleared highways. Mark turned from the window and stepped onto the braided rug. I've taken the journey annually, and I know the risks. But what price is to be paid to save my father's life? Everyone waited for Frank's return. Mark's children, knowing nothing of the village or their grandfather's pending suicide, were animated at the kitchen table. Mark hardly looked up from his food during the meal and was consumed by the village's elitist society. Several times he caught his wife's gentle smile across the table. Finally she stood and put her hands on his shoulders. Mark, you of all people, not being a villager, should know there are some things you can't control. Jane, they have no basic respect for life. I'm not a wide-eyed fanatic. I just have to ask why life isn't valued in the village. Oh, they say it is. They have all their options open and imagers enhancing any possibility. And they say outsiders like us in the real world have no respect for human dignity. It's a classic argument, Mark. Where is Frank? He'll be back. Word didn't get to him till later this afternoon. He'll be back. Frank, a larger man than Mark and stronger from working as a lumberjack in the forest camps, had a sloping Embers forehead and curly brown hair. Still covered with tree sawdust on his tight bronzed arms, he angrily burst through the door. "I'm going to the village. If I have to go tonight, Mark, I'm going." Mark, already crossing the room, was afraid he might wake the younger children. He led his brother out the front door and they walked across the porch. A faint glow from the sunset silhouetted hills and the stars twinkled across the darkening summer skies. "Frank, have you seen the... Henry played back that inspector's tape. This is insane." "I know it is. I placed a call to Dad, but I haven't had any response." "Why the hell did Neal convince him to go to the village anyway?" Mark stroked his beard and looked down. "Dad was caught off guard after Mom died. He never should have gone to visit Neal while he was so vulnerable. Now it's led to this. I mean, Frank, what I would give to have Mom back here now, and now this ending, whatever the hell it is." Frank put his hand on his brother's shoulder. "Listen to me. I won't allow those brain-implanted imager-headed villagers to do this. We still have time. I'm leaving tonight. By tomorrow afternoon I can arrive at the exposure and meet with Neal. Can't go alone, Frank. There'll be risk. Villagers don't take kindly to outsiders. They'll deport them into the woods and worse. You have a family here. I don't. That's my responsibility." Frank grinned and exhaled. "That's the crux of it, what you just said. Responsibility. Villagers have no responsibility, only self-indulgence." Mark put his hands in his jeans pocket. Putting himself at risk with a wife and 4 little kids was not a good idea. And by being available to receive the village transmission, if it came in at all, might delay his father's suicide. He nodded his head, took out his truck keys from his pocket, and handed them to his brother. "Take my truck, Frank. It's more durable than your car, and you can handle the rough roads. When you get to the exposure, call the transmission shack." Frank gazed into his brother's eyes for a moment and then hugged his brother. "If I can stop it, I'll stop it." He turned and sprinted toward the shed. Mark nudged his way onto the lawn as the truck started. The headlights brightened and Frank backed down the wooded drive to the street. He beeped the horn several times. The red rear lights glowed, and the headlights illuminated the road as Frank disappeared up the forested hill. Mark prayed that Frank would be in time to avert a possible tragedy. Henry stood at the door early the next morning. A message had come through during the night indicating Mark's father would be available to receive a transmission any time during the day. Mark had learned that all attempts to contact Neal were futile. He kissed Jane and hurried with Henry on foot back to the transmission hill. Mark's heart pounded as he gazed into the tiny black camera lens atop the old monitor. What would he say to his father? He hadn't seen his father in such a long time. His father was impulsive, less patient with the real-world ways and the cold. Villagers, so used to experiencing their lives within simulated images, had lost the ability to touch out and empathize with others. A red wavy image was formed on the screen. His father was fishing by a mountain stream, knee-deep in his waders and waving with his net. He looked not a day older than when he left for the village all those years ago. Surely not the appearance of a man who was going to die. Yet Mark knew this was all a fabrication, controlled and formulated by the imager within his father's brain.
"Hey, I see you, Mark. Where's Frank?"
For a few moments, Mark did not know what to say, and his thoughts were clouded by a young blonde woman dressed in a brown flannel shirt and jeans who was walking up the riverbank. Maybe she was fabricated too. "Dad, I know about your ending." His father's facial expression changed. He threw down his net, and the entire screen began to reshape. There was no more river, no blonde, no idyllic country setting. Walter Embers, now gray-haired, his eyes tired and drawn, stood in a green villager suit. Around him were the simple white dwelling walls.
How did you find out, Mark? Does Frank know?"
"Frank knows." His father's wrinkled face tightened, and Mark felt the tears in his own eyes. He wished his father had never gone to the village. If only he could hold his father now instead of seeing an image 235 kilometers away.
"Neal told you, didn't he? He wanted to go peacefully and let my form continue within an external imager. I didn't want anyone to be hurt by my death."
Mark's fist tightened and tears went down his cheek. "Dad, that's just it. Death does hurt people. You grieve and you deal with it. You fight against the reality and you move on. I don't want your death to be covered up, to be fixed within some simulation. I'm so sorry, Dad.
Mark, sadness is so unnecessary. My images will be here for you. If you lived in the village, you could have me with you always.
Only it wouldn't be you, Dad. It would be an imager telling me it was you.
It's the same, Mark.
Mark shot out of the chair. No! No, it's not the same. Don't you people understand? What's real is real in the real world, and it's not an image. His father didn't appear affected by his pleas. It was useless to continue an argument begun years ago in his father's living room right here in town. Mark leaned toward the camera. Dad, Frank is on his way up there.
Why?
Because there may be something wrong here. I've talked with some security people in the village. Please check your medical scans. There's a concern that they may not be correct. You may not be terminally ill, Dad.
Scans don't lie, Mark.
Dad, for God's sakes. They think you might not be terminal. At least check it out, please. You just don't want me to end my biological life. No, I don't. Whatever happened to saving life?
Suffering, Mark. I'm not going to suffer.
Then have them rescan you. His father's imager changed and he reformulated the screen. Walter Embers stood in front of his Zephyr Springs house and Mark saw his own image with him. He turned from the screen. I'm not going to be a party to this fabrication. He turned back from the screen. Henry shook his head and motioned toward what was now a bright white blank screen. Mark reached out slowly and ran his fingertips over the dirty glass, fully aware that he would never see his father alive again. Neal watched the drogues vacuum Walter's remaining crystals off the dwelling floor. He immediately instructed the imager in his brain to retrieve his father's form. The imager connected to Walter's dwelling imager. There was a beep and the little green drogues vanished. Then his father was before him, young and vital, perhaps in his 30s. Hello, Neal. How is my ending? Quick. Neal and Walter stood by their favorite mountain stream, the same stream he had imaged Walter for Mark's benefit. Mark did not need to know that Walter had already ended. Good, good. It was nice of you to soothe my biological departure with Mark. Neal was so frightened that Walter was gone forever. Biological endings were so final. Well, I am glad to see you, Walter. If only Frank and Mark could understand how far we've come. Why do they remain in such primitive conditions? Neal knew he was only speaking with a mainstream image, as real as any village image. When Walter was biologically alive, Neal saw him more in images than in real form. To view his wide smile again was reassuring. Well, Mark lives on the outside and refuses to align himself with the village, so I guess that means not participating, and not participating means not being able to use the imagers. He never wanted an imager inside his head. Is Frank driving all the way from Zephyr Springs? Asked Walter. Yes. I have to make arrangements to meet with him in the exposure. Think of it, Neal. Traveling in some gasoline-powered vehicle when you could be imaged. I don't get it. Neal was upset that Frank would bother him, but he was even more angry with Mark for trying to insinuate that the medical scans were wrong. Not to trust the advancement of science in the village was ludicrous. No wonder Mark had stayed behind. It was a cheap way to prolong Walter's life and cause needless suffering. Before I go, Dad, Razor and I, as you know, have formed a dozen biological templates. We have an appointment to approve or reject many of those templates. Substantive templates? You mean reproductive? Does it matter? No, that's good news. That's good news, Neal. Have you chosen your providers? Well, Razor has made those appointments with the village. It's important that the village have providers to nourish any offspring we might have, Walter. When the children reach a proper maturity level, we'll have our images interact with theirs and form a family situation. Throwing out all the bad templates is so stressful. Families are an important aspect of village life. You made the right decision, Neal. Once they actually birth the templates, please let me see my new grandchildren. You'll be the first to know, Walter. I'm glad you're here. Me too. See you soon, Neal. When the simulation ended, the drogues were lined up at the opening to Walter's dwelling. Like any dwelling, it contained 10 or 20 simulation rooms. The drogues probably wanted him to sign off on his own account.
Is this ending on your father's account or your account?
What difference does it make?
None.
Then put it on my father's with my voice signature. The legal mainstream will, of course, transfer all account debits and assets to the appropriate areas. But the drogues remained in front of the opening. Drogues were such bores. They didn't possess human abstract thinking and were inferior. Sometimes they annoyed him greatly. Neal spoke in a loud voice. Well, go on, get out of here.
Your brother is not eligible for entry into the exposure. Outsiders must be granted a security visa. Shall we request such a visa?
It's really none of your business. Now, come on. Humans should handle human matters, Drogue. They scattered as he moved down the transit walkway. Darkness fell over the Denver sector as he stepped into the clear transit tube. Thousands of dwelling modules, lineally embedded within the high pale green street walls, glowed white. Brightened transit tubes followed the levels above the canyon. He feared leaving the village. Outside time was different. He debated whether to interrupt his sleep pattern for Frank's arrival. Maybe he could avoid all the bickering about his father's ending if he prevented his brother's entry. Through the multi-seated transit car window, his imager formed a boring mountain scene. He quickly ordered up an image of the old west coast of the United States. He hadn't decided whether to let Frank or Mark inside the village, nor would he answer their calls. They had refused to participate in the village life, and now they had to suffer the ramifications of that decision. Being a villager, Neal would always have Walter at his beck and call. Progress had its benefits.